Well, hello everyone. We're back live again. This time maybe an hour earlier. We're going to have a talk about this whole month was about basically parenthood and what is regarding to the children and so forth. And we got all the information possible from every different aspect to get that through to you. And I hope that was also interesting for you as well. My name is A.G. Ilbegi. I'm a cognitive behavior therapist working with also with Talkatus at talkatus.com. And today we're going to have Emile. Last time I had a talk with her a few weeks ago. And we have it also now recording, so you can take a look at that as well. And they have a platform, and they do also research on neuroscience, which I think is very important and is, again, it's not rocket science, so people, it's integrative. They try to also get people to understand exactly what is going on within us, what happens in the brain when you have a certain situation, certain feeling, and so forth, and it's very comprehensive. And today we'll be talking about basically what happens, exploring what happens to the brain of a child while it's in pregnancy and when it's basically just born. So now, without further ado, I'll see whom I can get neuroscience. Ina, yes. And let me see if he is here already. Connection. There she is. Hello.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's nice.
All right, great. Well, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about something very specific, actually. And this will be about what happens, basically the brain of a child. You know, whatever that is important and necessary to know. And my first question, first of all, I mean, we do have already a recording about you and your company. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company as well? This INA.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the introduction as well. So for those who didn't join the previous conversation, I work with Integrative Neuroscience Association. We primarily operate in Lithuania, and our goal is kind of to spread neuroscience in Lithuania through different means. So we operate through three main kind of pillars, one being neuroscience education and availability and accessibility to everyone. Then the second being clinical innovation and research encouragement in the field of neurosciences, neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry. And the third of our aspects is advocacy against mental health stigma, against hidden disabilities, discrimination, and things along those lines. So we care a lot about the integration of the work, as Ali has explained already. And so one of our important features is sharing all this work with all of you guys and receiving all of your questions. So also feel free to ask questions throughout. And that's why we're so excited to engage in conversations like these as well. I'm personally, my name is Emile. I'm currently a neuropsychiatry PhD student here at Oxford. Focusing primarily on neuropsychiatric diseases and illnesses and their potential treatments, but have a lot of experience working with childhood development, especially delivering lectures on the topic. So I'll try to share things that I know about the topic, and also I'm excited to hear Ali's perspectives and any of your relevant questions as well.
Thank you so much. Again, it's really a pleasure talking to you because you're really to the point and you're so eloquent that I can just listen to you all day, actually. It's pretty good. So anyway, we start because one thing. I mean, I do quite a bit of research myself because it's also my interest to know more about the person, the self, and not only from the physical standpoint, but also from the spiritual side, what that is. Anyway, we're not going to get into that, but even there, I'm looking into, and I see a lot of interactions between what we see as science, which for me is actually work in progress, as I said also before. And it's good to be open-minded about that. And this thing that we call, spirituality, consciousness, and so on and so forth. But let's get now to the consciousness part of it. We've heard a lot about, when somebody's pregnant, when they said, oh my God, now this is the pregnancy, and you should not do this, you should not do that, you should watch out, and don't, lift weights, don't do this, be all this, the whole 9 yards, okay? We know about that. And there's probably reasons, so there is not too much stress on the person. But one thing that they don't really talk about is actually psychological stress, which sometimes is much worse than physical stress that actually comes along. So when, I mean, I had this also information, as I said, from Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's also a researcher, a biologist, and also works on the cells, DNA, and so on and so forth. Anyway, he comes, and according to him, the third trimester, when the baby is in the womb, the consciousness already kicks in. Consciousness already is a kind of a mystic thing. We're trying to find out what it is. Being conscious, unconscious, that we know already from physical term. But I don't know if you know anything about that, but what is it when the baby is, it's about the last 2-3 months before birth, basically. What are their, I mean, what do they sense? Do you know anything about that already, what is the sense of a child when they're in there, and what are they absorbing?
Yeah, sure. So these are a lot of very interesting and quite disparate questions as well. So one thing is, again, as you alluded, we actually don't know what consciousness is. What we do know is that it's somehow linked to brain activity. We don't yet know what kind of brain activity that would be.
Yeah.
The way I look at development, especially at this earlier stage, is that really a child's brain as it's developing, especially in the womb, has two main goals. One is to be able to take in information once it's born from its environment in order to adapt to it. And the second part is to be able to respond to it in an evolutionarily adaptive way. So the two main features that have to develop before birth have to really be the sensory stuff, so the ability to take in all the information. So we're talking visual intake, we're talking hearing, we're talking as well, you know, emotional, like grimaces and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, as well. But the other part is also the motor part, so how do you respond to the world? So those are the main things that need to develop in the womb. At which point of this consciousness kicks in, unfortunately, is a very difficult question because we just don't know what consciousness is. If we did decide it, then I guess we could give a more precise timing on when that does happen. In many ways, if we treat consciousness the way that some scientists treat it, which is the awareness of one's own behavior, then that would kick in the moment that sensory inputs start governing motor outputs, which would be probably around the second or third trimester as well. There was something you mentioned initially as well, I mean, related to stress. And we can also delve into that deeper as well. But whenever we talk about development of children's brains, we should also talk about development and changes that happen in the parents' brains as well, because now we have increasing research on the topic, even though it is limited. And so one of the things is that the child actually becomes responsive to the mother's native environment very early on, like from the first trimester on, and is very sensitive to it. And in fact, is much more sensitive to the kind of metabolical changes that happen in her body. And metabolical changes include cortisol, one of the most best known, you know, stress hormones, which are obviously very responsive to physical stress as well as mental stress. And actually a lot of the things that what you mentioned of socially that we tell mothers to do these things or not to do these things, those actually generate a lot of psychological stress that consequently ends up generating more of that cortisol. So by trying to prevent one type of cortisol origination, you elicit the other kind. So there are a lot of these factors that are embedded in those first, you know, months of life. But at least this is the relationship that I see between them.
Okay. And now what would you, from the information that you just gave me, tell a person, a mother who's pregnant, okay? The doctor says this, the friend says that, the mother says this, everybody yaps around and says certain well-meaning, okay? And this is also stressful also for the person, for the mother. As you said, you've also looked into that as well, because a lot of hormonal changes and all that happens within the mother actually who's pregnant. What would you give? What would be the best thing that one would say, without getting too much into details? So, I mean, what would be, you know, just chill, to just go with the flow?
My advice was about to be exactly that. Just don't stress about it. And I mean, the real reason is, I mean, the reason people don't say this is because by telling someone not to stress, you know, you can generate a different stress response if a person currently is stressing. But I think the way to view it is that your body, the reason that there are so many changes happening is because your body is not in a usual state. This is not the type of body that you normally know it. So it's not in homeostasis. So the point is you don't actually know the rules of this game. And so the point is to listen to your brain because it's about to tell you the rules of the game. So, you know, if you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat. You don't need to eat. You know, if you feel like exercising, exercise. If you don't feel like exercising, you know, don't exercise. And I mean, it sounds like simple advice and maybe primitive, but if you talk to mothers, honestly, if you talk to most people, that's why behavioral change is so difficult, is most people cannot hear what their brain is telling them to do. And as long as you're able to act intuitively with that sense, I mean, people have been pregnant over generations and, you know, like it is a developed adaptive trait. And the point is that we, in many ways, have muted those signals to which we used to be very sensitive and adapted to. And the point is to hear them again. So the chilling part is more related to the fact of just hear your body, it probably knows.
Exactly.
And every person will obviously be different, but yeah.
I mean, a very good friend of mine and a colleague, which also went to university with me, and she got pregnant. And we were, I mean, she's a workaholic. And she was sitting there, she got so extremely emotional because she had already the stomach, and we're doing this project together, and that she had to move around a lot. And I was very, very, very concerned. Say, listen, do you think you can do with this? I know you're a workaholic, but think it's two of you now, okay? So, and she goes, no, it's going to be fine, and I'll notice it. And there were some issues or something going on which you could take it like this. But she got all emotional and she started crying. and I had to hug her, say it's okay. And she goes, I'm pregnant. What can I do? I'm like, you don't have to do anything. It's fine. Just go with it. Exactly what you said. I say, chill. I'll take over. No. But what about... You take over, I'm going to take care of it. And that gave her such ease, and the tears were gone, and everything was actually fine. So it's a lot just to basically being around them and as an outsider supporting them. And also one thing that I noticed is to avoid not only stresses that the mother takes, but from the environment, loud music, loud noises. I mean, certain things which really are, or I see people that go to certain parties and they're kind of pregnant. I'm like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
I mean, the boom, 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 the music is going, the kid is not knowing what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the responsiveness to the environment is something very important to take into account. I think one interesting twist to me personally from the research that I have discovered is actually the sensitivity to the native language. So obviously now you were talking about quite a few like toxic, environmental traits, so like, loud music and things like that, which obviously affected. Right. In fact, air pollution has shown an effect as well. So like living in cities as opposed to outside of them. But something that I found interesting is that in the 7th month of gestation, so in the womb, most children become responsive also to their parents' native language. So the way that the brain processes work is essentially you try to develop a sensitivity to a bunch of different phonemes, which are sounds of different languages. And when you're born, you're supposed to kind of get rid of all of the ones that don't fit your environment because you're trying to optimize the ones that you have for your parents' language or for the environment that you're born in. And then the 7th month, the language that the child hears about them is kind of the one that they prioritize the phonemes for. So when they're born, they're actually, so for example, if you live, let's say in Lithuania, and you were pregnant while you were living in Lithuania, after the child is born, it will find Lithuanian as a language easier to learn than any other language, which is kind of interesting. And obviously it can assimilate, especially in bilingual families or mothers who travel between different countries and environments. But that's kind of like an interesting aspect for it as well.
Okay, now that has gone. Now we come after birth. Okay, are there any changes that happens after birth? I mean, for the child naturally, but for the mother too. And do they go back to ground zero and it's as if nothing has happened? I mean, could you give me a bit of the mother and a bit of the thing? Or
sure.
We're very generalizing, by the way, here.
Oh yeah, no, for sure, yeah.
So that's I just want to say ahead of time. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. So you definitely don't go back to ground zero. The one thing that, I mean, really the difference between not being born and being born is twofold. One, you have to kind of survive on your own, and two, you finally get outside inputs. So like that's why you need a well-developed sensory stimulation, and now you suddenly like see the world and you have to kind of deal with it on yourself. And you kind of have to make sure that an adult takes care of you as opposed to that being kind of presumed before you're born. So those are the main changes, which I think are important to visualize, because for the brain these are the challenges that it deals with. Because initially it doesn't have to bother about getting food, about getting sleep. It's all in there, and then when it leaves, it has to figure all of those things out. So I think some of the more interesting recent research, which I will refer to because I think it's more interesting, has shown that after birth, children's and mothers' brains synchronize. And I will make sure that in this conversation, even though I'm talking about mothers, there's very promising research. I saw the comment to speak a bit slower, so I will. Thanks so much. Yeah, but the main idea is that after a child is born, what we do notice is some synchrony between the primary caretaker, the primary parent, and the child. The reason I would prefer using that language is, even though obviously most mothers are female who just say them and so on and so forth, what has been shown is that the differences in brain changes after birth are more similar between the primary caregiver, more dependent on who spends more time with the child as opposed to what the gender of the parent is. So if the primary caregiver is actually the father, the changes that are associated normally with mothers are seen in them. So regardless of the gender distribution or work distribution, it's more related to the time spent with the child that we see those effects. So normally there is a stronger predisposition to have that with your mother just because you've technically been with her longer because you were in the womb. But if a father spends very long amounts of time with the child after birth, they will develop the same changes. So just to kind of encourage some consistency. And the reason for this research being so interesting and novel is because before that, people used to pretty much only study mothers in this relationship, and then they wouldn't see the difference. But now with the recent study of fathers as well, they've been able to see that. So some of the main changes that happen is after a child is born, what we see is some synchrony from, especially on the empathy levels. So for example, we see that the child and the mother are more attuned to each other's mood changes than they are to any other people. And again, mother, primary caregiver, and so on, which is quite interesting. That research is emerging, and it has been done by putting in like EEG recording, so like recording the electrical signals from both the child and the mother at the same time. And it's quite interesting because we don't really know what that synchrony means. What we argue is that it's supposed to create like, better attunements to each other's behavior. And the reason for that is that the primary caregiver has to provide for the child, and it's evolutionarily adaptive. Something else that we notice is that for the first 2 years after birth, the primary caregiver is much more sensitive to the grimaces, so the face changes that happen in a child, and the child for the first 2 years of birth expresses emotion much better than they do kind of later in life. Like that's one of the main focuses, because the idea is that you cannot yet tell what you need or just cry or so on. So you try to show all of your emotions through your facial expression. So kind of the attunement to it is also very. But
also there comes also this whole thing about the mirror neurons. By mirror neurons, we mean that basically that mirrors what they see. I mean, we still do it. I mean, when you look at yourself or feel yourself when you're watching a movie, and it's funny, or two people are, that's not funny, but two people are laughing and they're smiling, all of a sudden you're sitting there and you're smiling too. So that is happening to us as adults too. So as with children, is that also something which is mainly mirror neurons? When you look at them, you go, into the thing, you smile at them. Do they smile at you because they feel that way, you think? Or is it because it's a mirror neuron? Because you're smiling at me, I'm smiling back.
That's an interesting question. I do remember seeing some research about it. It will probably come back to me because because there is some interesting research on baby talk, and the reason why we talk to children is if they don't understand everything, and that's kind of the impulse as well. But to your earlier point on mirror neurons, so I would differentiate between two main things. One is behavioral expression, and one is the neurological underlying of it. So the behavioral expression would obviously be synchrony, like you cross your arms in this discussion, I cross my arms, you hold your chin, I do that. So that's so that's a mirror behavior. But that's not necessarily that we have mirror neurons. And the reason I'm skeptical of this is because I actually had a close colleague of mine working on synchrony, and as far as she told me, most of the research in the field has been debunked. Like, you only need to account for that many variables, and we don't actually know why synchrony happens. And it's more likely to be a socially adaptive trait, because it is also seen that a lot of psychopaths actually, or sociopaths, they don't mirror someone else's language, which if we had mirror neurons, you could argue, they would, because that's just like, a responsive trait. But since they don't, the argument is that it's actually like, I'm trying to bond with you, therefore I'm acting the way that you are acting. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical of that type of literature. But as I was saying before, like kind of the synchrony between the parent and child in the earlier days has been shown pretty accurately, and that's related to like the emotional attunement, whatever that may mean within the purposes of the experiment as well. So we do notice that. And it's last thing that I will mention that does happen as a change, which is an interesting change, and I will use mothers as like the primary caregiver. So most mothers after the first 2 years of birth do have overactive amygdala regions. So for those people in the audience, amygdala is usually associated with fear response and overly emotional response. So the thing is, the first 2 years after birth, mothers are especially sensitive to the safety of the child. So that's kind of the overactive part of the brain, and over time it kind of reduces, but it still remains quite active. Whereas fathers or any type of secondary caregiver show higher activation in the superior temporal sulcus, which for those in the audience also aware is mostly associated with theory of mind. So the idea of inferring other people's thoughts. So one of the relationships is much more, you could say, emotional, and the other one cognitive, which I always found like an interesting division because they're obviously interlinked. But the argument is that fathers, in order to bond with their child, have to exert much more cognitive effort in order to understand where the child is coming from and so on, whereas mothers have the intuition or whatever, but that's actually just an over heightened emotional response. And obviously it was seen flipped as well. If fathers spent more time with their child, they also showed an overactive emotional response.
And but principally, as of when can we say that the child is cognitively aware of his or of its, let's say here, environment? I mean, from what I know, they sense it. There's certain things that one senses as a child. Okay, I did this research on cognitive. It was CHE, basically children with heart defect. When they were born and how they were treated, so forth, they sensed a lot their environments. If there was a fighting going on, they sensed it. If there's some kind of a mismatch, they sense it. If there's love, they sense it. And that's one thing. The other thing is, because we're talking about cognition and so forth, when are they cognitively there that they know? They just don't go through the feeling and these things that we don't know about that in details yet, But when are they cognitively there? So they go, I think, therefore I am, something like that. I don't want to be the native cow here, but it's saying that they understand, cognitively feel and understand. As of when approximately does that actually kick in?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm playing with fire here, but the real answer is, at which point are you really there? Like, if you're still the same person or not. And I mean, there are different theories on that. And for example, if your mind is wondering, are you there or are you not there? Like, for example, if you're not actively thinking of anything. But I'm here playing along because the real question is, if the question is, when are they there? Then, again, you link it to the first time they start feeling their environment, which is actually pretty early on. It's like the first couple of months that they start sensing the environment. They start sensing light and darkness and so on. So that would be very early on in the womb. They're already responsive to things that are happening around them. And hence, we give all of those recommendations to the mothers and so on and so forth. But mentally, it's very difficult to tell when that actually subjective ego emerges. And the reason for that is because, one, we cannot measure it. And the other problem is, I don't think I mentioned it in our previous talk, but it's a very well-known theory of mind. And the idea is that we can never know the minds of others. And so the idea is that the minds of others are always hidden to us, so we can never check whether someone else is actually conscious. And I think that that's very relevant for this discussion, is that I apologize for not giving an answer, but it's unlikely it will ever be given. So, yeah.
Okay. Let's get to that part, which I know, which is essential, and this is very important, and it's actually, it's a fact because we've seen the results of that, and it's the power of human touch. When the child is there, a lot of times when you see certain children when they're neglected, they don't really cognitively feel that being neglected or understand. They feel it, and a lot of times when you see a kid that hasn't been touched for a while, they always go like this. They want you to hug them. They want you to touch them, pick them up, do something with them. And if this is neglected and not done, like in many cases where we have that in Romania was the case. We have a lot of children after 4 or 5 years where the brain development is not that far yet, is not that developed, and when it goes past this stage, then a lot of disorders are imminent.
Yeah.
So what does that have to do with this touch thing? I mean, what is it that triggers?
Yeah. So this links me to two main points, I guess, that I want to make. One is that just parental involvement is extremely important to the development of the brain very early on in life. So it has been shown that the points spending quality time with parents by the child is directly proportional to both their IQ development, their emotional development, and all of these other salient points. And obviously time spent with a parent will oftentimes include touch. So sometimes those things are difficult to disentangle. Like, what is the effect of actual, touch and the release of oxytocin, and how much of it is like the actual cognitive interaction and so on. The second thing that I do want to mention, which is quite interesting, and you might have heard of it as well in the psychological literature, but sometime in the 70s or 80s, there was the big research done with the unfriendly mother. So what they did is they tested a bunch of monkeys, and they had different example mothers. So one of them was a fake mom for a monkey that was very furry and cute and kind of, was soft. Yeah, you might have seen that research. And so it was like a soft mother, and then, the all of the monkeys would crawl onto it, and, they want to hug her, they want to be with her, and blah, blah, blah. And there was the unfriendly mom, which was like made of wood, like very, like the children didn't want to be around her. And then they showed some antisocial behaviors among those those monkeys that spend time with the unfriendly mom. And that actually led to a big sleuth of developments in psychology, where they argued that if mothers are too cold to their children, that's going to lead to autism development in children. And so that is also related to like the lack of touch with a mother and so on. That has been very widely debunked since, because obviously we cannot have that much influence. And also autism is linked to so many environmental traits and so many genetic traits as well, actually. But I think for me, the takeaway is that one, research in this area still needs a lot of development and so on. And the reason for that is that one, parents are a very sensitive population to study. And two, we can never disentangle the effect of touch from a child with all the other types of involvement, so like cognitive stuff and so on. And finally, what we do know for sure is that any type of touch will develop some form of oxytocin, and oxytocin allows for bonding. And we also know that spending quality time also leads to higher levels of development in a child. So in whichever case, it cannot be bad, but how bad its absence can be also remains unclear.
Well, I got two questions actually that just popped up now while we're talking about this. We're going to get back to David's as well, David AWD. We're going to get to you too as well. But the one that we're talking about mothers and so forth, we got this thing. What if the mother is too soft, is a softy? I mean, the softy, quote unquote softy, and we have to understand what soft means. If that means that the child can do whatever it wants to do, or the child, because they understand one thing I noticed, the children, even before they start talking, they want to see their limits. They want to see how far they can go, And a soft mother would, I don't know what a soft mother is. When they're too gushy, oogie boogie with them and all that, and not really taking them as an individual, but as my beautiful love, and you can do whatever you want to do.
I mean, my interpretation, again, like, I don't know what really too soft would mean, unless we're talking about monkeys getting attached to a very soft pillow. But I think other than that, my interpretation would be is the inability to draw boundaries. And then we go into a completely different area, which is not related to emotional availability, which to me is the hard and soft mother, conjunction. Right. But then we go to what is, essentially like child development and, teaching children about life, which is very different. It's drawing boundaries. It's drawing like, teaching people about emotions and how you operate in the world, how you treat other people and so on. And that softness is independent. I think what we often do is actually confound different things. That being emotionally available, you make it equivalent to, being weak or something, or like doing whatever, like, the mushy gushy things you described. And I think we should separate this, because one is the, again, emotional availability and being there for the person, and at the same time being cognitively able to draw some particular states, which is the point of, having to raise children and teach them all of those things.
Right. Okay. The other one from David was, is the amygdala the primary regulator of emotional response with the limbic system, or do other parts also significantly mediate emotional impulse?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it uses the word kind of regulate. So the way that the brain works is, if you have like a visualization of how a brain looks in front of you, like however broad that may be, essentially the oldest parts of the brain are deepest in it. And then all of the things that we gained as we became humans and we became this developed species are the things put on top of it. And what having these layers on top of the brain gives us is that allows us to control our most primitive instincts. So if you look at the brains of other animals, they will have the deeper layers, and then they will have something on top, but humans have really an unprecedented amount of stuff on top of it. And the main function of all of that stuff on top is actually to regulate the stuff on the bottom. So the stuff on the bottom is the things that I was talking about, including amygdala. So that's for example, all of the sensitive parts. So that's your initial gut response. That's where anger comes from. That's where, affection comes from, and so on. But then your brain, the higher layers of it, the cortex is supposed
basically,
to, exactly. The cortex is supposed to kind of control how you interpret that, how you interpret anger. Do you act on it? Do you not act on it? And so on. And so actually a critical part of development that happens mostly in adolescence. And that's actually what usually leads to so the critical period in adolescence is when the primary cortex is supposed to develop, and it's supposed to develop the ability to control, excess emotions. And when it doesn't, or if a child is experiencing particular trauma or something else during that point, what we see is then like long-term childhood adversity effects, and also vulnerability to a bunch of disorders, as well as, a predisposing, becoming more predisposed to a bunch of psychiatric illnesses as well, because there's just that inability to control very gut reactions that come from the emotional system. So if the answer to the question about the amygdala is really that, yes, that's where the original fear response originates, but it is always regulated by the primary cortex, regardless of how developed or underdeveloped it is. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Okay. Good. And now one thing just popped up to me, because that was also very interesting for me, and I also say it here now. If you can get a hold of it, please go take a look at it. And it's called From Birth to Death. It's a BBC documentation, and there's a doctor, it's a sir as well, something Wilson, and it goes through the ages as we're born, and prenatal, so to say, then born, then how the social thing is, how depending on the environment, on the school, and it keeps on going. But the best part is the teenage time. Because when it comes to being a teenager, that's why it's good for the parents to know as well, they say about 40%, because it's getting, everything in the brain is supposedly getting rewired. And they say about 40% is like under construction. So basically 40% is not actually, it's not there. That's why this thing and not thinking of doing something, doing dangerous thing, trying things out, because it's getting rewired and you're not really feeling the scary, that could be dangerous to do something. I take that as an example myself. The stuff that I used to do when I was a teenager skiing, when I think of it now, I go nuts. I'm like, were you crazy doing that? But then at the time, I was fully into it and I was going to do it without a second of thinking, this could be dangerous. And yeah, it is dangerous, but hey, man, but it's cool. I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah, so I have a pretty... yeah, I have quite a bit of information on the topic, because things that happen during adolescence are obviously, again, as I said, critical to the regulatory processes. And I mean, honestly, if 40% is under construction, it would be better for many of those children in terms of risk assessment to have it inactive at the time, because it's actually worse that it is in progress. Because the reason that children, especially in adolescence, take so many risks is because they need to be exposed to different scenarios in order to get familiar with unfamiliar settings, in order to know what to do in them. So actually the development of amygdala, of which we spoke before in terms of fear, its critical development also happens in adolescence, where you're supposed to teach your amygdala of what is scary and what is not scary. And oftentimes, because before adolescence, you were just a child, you weren't in that many scary scenarios because you were usually protected or in a kind of safe environment. So during adolescence, you try to kind of go on extremes in order to figure out, oh, this hurts. Okay, I should be afraid of this. And oh, this is actually not that bad. So maybe I shouldn't be scared of this. And this is when you develop your threat response. And that's actually the reason for what I mentioned before, the susceptibility to psychiatric illnesses. Because if during that time your amygdala gets exposed to scenarios, so for example, you go home and you see an angry parent, and let's say there's domestic abuse or something, you understand that any person who is mildly angry might, for example, exert violence against you. And obviously, like, a lot of people are like, oh wow, you're paranoid if you look from a different perspective. But it's not paranoia. It's the idea that the amygdala was trained that something in the expression of another person led to a particular behavioral response. So this is the critical treatment that happens at that particular stage. Now, speaking of impulsivity, which is again a hallmark that you spoke of, not being afraid of some things and then suddenly, and now looking back thinking that was unreasonable. So that's actually the primary cortex again. So one of its main functions is obviously control of emotions, but the other one is control of judgment, the ability to make decisions. And really its ultimate point is, again, as I was mentioning, it's in the top of the brain. So its purpose is to integrate all of the signals that come from all across the brain. So, all of the visual signals, what you know, and then with everything that you know from the past, your memory and things like that, and then reach the best conclusion, reach the best decision. And obviously if that process is hindered, then you will lead to not fully calculated decisions. But the real point is that maybe you just didn't receive a critical part of information, even though your brain had it, because it wasn't connected to the primary cortex. So the 40% under construction in many ways is not only the separate parts of the brain that are developing, but really the tracts, the kind of like, train tracks between the different places. And and our ability to make decisions is not a part of, it's not the decision made by a particular part of the brain, but it's the ability to take in everything that the brain has and then lead to something, both a logical conclusion, but also the most reasonable conclusion, which might not always be the logical one.
Right. Because one other thing that I saw that just also, all these things are popping in my head right now. One other thing that I saw is the psychologists that were doing tests on children, and that's what they said. I guess that depends on what their environment was, maybe while they're in the womb or something. Because they wanted to see the 2-year-old child having the response towards fear between one and the other. And how do they test it? Because they don't speak. You have to do things with them. One was this, like a box where something jumped out, okay? And when they turned the whole thing around, goes bing, and this thing jumped out, hey, 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 like a clown.
Yeah.
And one starts laughing, and yeah, do it again. They did the same with the other one. As it jumped out, this thing jumped out almost of the mother's hand, screaming in fear, getting scared. What was this? Oh my God, you know? Or one daring to take a step down. One would jump, the other one would turn around and, you know, test the waters and slowly go down. These are about they just began to walk. Okay, so it's very, very new there. And one is like this, and the other one is like that. That's when we talk about nature and nurture. Is that where it comes in?
I mean,
nature is like this.
Yeah, I mean, nature and nurture will come in at every step of the way because we all start with different brains, and part of the wiring, again, as I was explaining initially, does happen in the womb and is affected by the internal environment there. But also, I mean, I would treat the first at least, 20 years as a learning experience. Like, that's the exposure to new environments when you get trained. So even if you have these children having completely different responses, let's say at a 6-month age, if you try to test them then, I mean, actually, the experiences between 6 months and 2 years could be critical, and maybe they will have the same response by 2 years. So there's so much developmental shift and that happens during that time. And I mean, we spoke a little bit about neuroplasticity last time, but what we know is that brains do change all our lives, and they're extremely plastic at that point. Like, it's almost like you can be very scared of some things and then have one good experience and not be scared of it at all, which sounds very silly and almost unbelievable to maybe an adult person who but I just mean that to most adults, like, you would need a statistical sample, right? Whereas for a child, you just don't have the statistics. So, whatever you see is your reality. And especially, like, if you look at, and we haven't yet spoken about cognitive development stages, but one of the main stages that happens in a child is the ability to dissociate that the reality is not fully egocentric. It means that the reality is not only the way I see it. Like, you, Ali, might have a different perspective on reality is actually a developmental landmark, because children for a long time believe that, it's only about them. Like, fundamentally, like, if I hide myself, then it means my face is non-existent because it doesn't exist to them. And so I think this is also characteristic of all of those changes that you learn after birth. Yeah.
Now we're talking about children there. As of what time do they feel the ego, the self? Why do I say that? Because they even try that with animals as well. But they tried it with certain children where they look at them, they point the finger, that was a test, and they start laughing at them. Ha, 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 ha. And the child was looking at them and ha, 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 laughing with them. So it didn't really notice the thing with the self, as we were just talking about this. But as of a certain age, when they start doing that with them, they sensed it, and they got upset, and they're looking down, and when they go like this, they really sense it, that I'm being laughed at.
Mocking, yeah. So
I'm being mocked.
Yeah, so this comes from, obviously, you'll be familiar from classical psychological theory. I still think it's a good way of framing these things, even though we know that they're more heterogeneous than we think. But the first stage of development before the age of 2 is called the sensory motor stage, when children learn about the physical properties of the world around them. And that's actually the period during which self-recognition, so recognition of oneself in the mirror, should emerge. Probably sometime, I mean, and honestly, it happens so differently for every child that it's difficult to tell, but it is usual for it to develop before the age of 2.
The age of 2, you said?
Before the age of 2, that would be expected.
Before the age of 2, yeah.
But again, like, the reason you wouldn't want to give these things is, like, not to suggest any type of delayed development, because as we spoke of a lot of worried mothers, like, if a child develops it at 2.5 years, it's probably fine.
Yeah, oh my God, what's happening? Oh my God, my child is almost 2 years old. It's not happening. Exactly. Mothers, please chill a little bit, okay? Get information and just relax, and everything will be just fine, okay? Just get more information. That's fine. So this other one, we have another 8 minutes that we're going to go here. I have 2 questions. Let's try to get this over. I mean, the last question is the most important for me because I experienced it myself. This one is, do children before speaking feel their environment? I think we talked about that. Happiness, sadness, quarrel, anxiety, and so forth that's going around them, they sense it between the age of, as of birth, so to say, they do sense this. But cognitively, we say as of when is the case? Because you feel something, but you don't know what it is. You just know it feels bad.
Yeah. I won't be tempted to give a time on this, just because I think that there's a different degree of sensing, which is what I kind of explained through the brain framework. I mean, one thing is to sense it at a very base emotion. Like, for some reason you want to cry. And like whether your brains tell you that that's because you're upset or whether you're angry, like you might yet as a child not be able to differentiate between actually anger and sadness, or, you know, happiness or being proud or something like that. But you feel it on some degree. And maybe later as you feel it, the qualia of it, the ability to feel it is different. Like the phenomenology of how you experience it might be different, but yet you can't say that you feel it differently now, right? So yeah, so, but we do know that children sense the environment around them and sense the emotional content of the environment upon birth, for sure.
Okay, now the last question. This is very important for me because we're talking about, you know, intelligence. You know, you're talking about IQ, intelligence, quotiency, or EQ. You know, emotional. Now we're getting to that cognitive memory versus emotional memory. I worked with a lot of people who had dementia, and short-term memory is completely shot. Long-term, only certain things that they remember, where there was a feeling behind it, they remember it like clear as day.
Yeah.
Where is there a place in the brain where this emotional memory is? I mean, we're putting a lot on the brain. I'm sure there are a lot of other parts in the body that even cellular memory is there too.
Sure.
But we're talking about the brain now. Is there any part in the brain that said this? We imagine this is where the emotional memory is. And I give you one last thing that I saw.
Sure.
I was working with this gentleman, fantastic gentleman, and he was getting worse and worse and worse. And he still remembered me, but as I was working also with him, he would not remember what we did the last time. But once I brought him a cake, chocolate cake, because I had it, you know, from somebody else, I gave it to him, and he loved chocolate cake. I didn't know that, and he was so happy. And then a week later, I just threw it in. I'm like, the chocolate cake, do you like the chocolate cake? And he's like, yes, it was delicious.
Yeah.
You know, I was stunned.
Yeah.
I was stunned that he knew that from last week. He knew it already. That's what I'm saying. Emotional, something that goes through the emotional. Where does that go in the head? Is there any place like that one has imagined?
Yeah. So, I mean, and you probably can answer it from some things that I've said already before, but an interesting aspect is that the part responsible for memory, and the research in this field, again, is still very emerging. But the main part for it is the hippocampus, and the place where it is in the brain is pretty deep. So you already know that it's part of our primitive system. So memory is important for development. And the reason why it's important is obviously you need to remember your past threats. And in fact, anatomically, it's right next to the amygdala because you're supposed to remember what was threatening. So it is very adaptive to have good memory on a bunch of threats. And again, like from what I'm saying, the amygdala is next to the hippocampus, responsible for memory. And all of these places are responsible for the emotional system, the limbic system that was mentioned in David's comment as well. So the idea is that like all of that emotional memory is so deeply embedded in our brain that we remember emotional things, both positive and negative, much stronger than anything that's, you know, put on top. And in fact, that has been shown that if you ask people to remember two strong memories, they will always also remember the negative memories much stronger than they will the positive memories. So not only is there a cognitive versus emotional hierarchy, we also remember better negative past events than we remember positive past events, which obviously sounds evolutionarily maladaptive, because then, you know, you can be upset about past events and that actually can eventually, if it's drastic, lead to trauma. But also, like if you think from an advantageous standpoint, that allows you to remember the threats and therefore allows you to avoid those things in the future, which is more important than, you know, seek out good things. It's like try not to die, which, you know, on the priority spectrum is a bit higher. Yeah, so that would be the main reason for emotional versus cognitive memory, but again, still not very clear. And also, I wouldn't distinguish. Yeah, we can summarize in a second, but also like my main comment was also about to be, we like to distinguish between cognitive and emotional so frequently. And I will just emphasize that all of our emotions as adults are mediated by cognitive, like, you know, functions if they are working well. And so like that world is still blurred, even if it's sometimes helpful to differentiate between the two when we're talking about them structurally.
Okay, thank you for saying that, because it's good to say that we don't know, or we don't know yet.
Sure.
We're very curious to find out what we don't know yet. So summarizing, we started from the childhood, when it's in the womb, when it comes out, basically, from the child to teenage to adulthood, actually, and also even now we those who are cognitively, so to say, that they do not remember, that have some kind of a disease, dementia, and what emotional memory is. Emile, I thank you so much. Our time is up.
Thank you so much for the questions and everything.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I hope to see you again too. And for everybody else that will be listening in, you can get in touch with us through through this media naturally as well. And if you can send us your feedbacks, what was interesting for you, again, further questions. And look into talkatus.com as well, or send us an email to hello@talkatus.com. And we have also a newsletter, which is good for you. So I think you have newsletter as well. I'm subscribed to your newsletter, but unfortunately it's not in English, so I have troubles reading it.
We're planning to do that eventually, but yeah, we highly encourage you all. Integrativeneuroscience.org. You can find a lot of our information, which is bilingual.
Yes, bilingual, fantastic. Yeah, no, the website definitely is incredible, and also the stuff you can read there in their blogs. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you again. Thank you,
so
everybody.
much. Hope it was interesting.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.